On August 9, 1969, members of Charles Manson's cult, known as the Manson Family, broke into the Beverly Hills home of movie director Roman Polanski. Inside, they attacked and took the lives of 5 separate individuals, including Sharon Tate, Roman's wife, who was 8.5 months pregnant. Following this gruesome spree, the members made their way to another home, where they carried out yet more violence, this time targeting a supermarket executive and his wife. The crimes of the Manson family were nothing short of savage, and they propelled the cult and its leader into worldwide notoriety. Charles Manson was virtually unknown to the public until this horrific stunt, and now his name was in newspaper headlines across the globe. But just who exactly was Charles? And what was the motivation behind the violent actions of his cult? In this documentary, we aim to shed light on these questions and more as we explore the life and crimes of Charles Manson. Welcome to Murderous Minds. Early life. Charles Mills Manson was born on November 12, 1934 in Cincinnati, Ohio. His mother, Kathleen Maddox, was just 15 at the time of his birth. Kathleen had met Manson's biological father during the 1930s. 8 years older, Colonel Scott Sr. was originally from Kentucky and had moved with his family to Ashland, Ohio, during the 1920s. When he met Kathleen, he let her believe that Colonel was his military rank, although it was in fact his given name. Scott also let the teenager believe he was unattached when he was married and took advantage of her naivety. He was known locally as a con man, and he worked occasionally in local mills. Scott took Kathleen out dancing and drinking, and the teenager was flattered by the attentions of the older man. The two met up on a regular basis, and in the spring of 1934, Kathleen discovered she was pregnant with his baby. But things didn't pan out for the teenager the way she had expected. When she told Scott her news, he told her that he'd been called away on military business, promising that he would return soon. Months passed before the 15-year-old realized that Scott would not be returning. Eventually, she came clean to her mother, Nancy, who informed her that the baby would be raised in the church so that Kathleen could atone for her sinful ways. In August of 1934, shortly before Manson's birth, Kathleen married William Eugene Manson, a 25-year-old employed at a dry cleaning business. Little is known about William Manson. He was born in 1909 in West Virginia and died in California at the age of 52, but it's unclear how the pair met. But their marriage certificate, dated August 21st, listed Kathleen's age as 21, suggesting that her parents were unaware of the union, as the teenager would have likely needed their permission to marry. William was listed as the baby's father on Manson's birth certificate, although he was aware that the child was not his. Although Kathleen was known to love her son, she was still young and not quite prepared for the sacrifices that come with parenthood. As she turned 16, she began spending her nights out away from home, leaving Manson in the company of babysitters or family members. She would share drinks with her brother and rarely spent time with her husband. Not much information is available about the state of the couple's relationship. It is believed that they remained in the Cincinnati area following their union, but family members quickly became concerned for Manson's welfare, with how often Kathleen was out. Sometimes she was gone for several days at a time. William Manson, meanwhile, quickly grew tired of Kathleen's attitude and behavior. On April 30th, 1937, after less than 3 years of marriage, the court ruled on his request for divorce. William charged his wife with gross neglect of duty, an umbrella term often used to cover acts such as infidelity, drunkenness, abandonment, or a combination of all of those things. Kathleen did not contest the divorce or defend herself, and William was not legally obligated to pay child support for baby Charles Manson. Just weeks before the divorce was finalized, Kathleen took herself to Kentucky and filed a bastardy suit against Colonel Scott. She had tracked him down, and she wanted him to take financial responsibility for the baby. The court subsequently ruled in her favor, but Scott failed to keep up the payments. Kathleen received an initial $25 from him, but not the $5 a month he was supposed to pay afterwards. Following the divorce, Kathleen and Manson moved around. Sometimes they stayed in Ashland with Nancy, while at other times they lived with various other family and friends. Kathleen eventually became engaged again to a man who had a lengthy criminal history of theft and bootlegging, but the relationship quickly dissolved before they tied the knot. In August of 1939, however, Kathleen's life took a sharp turn when she and her brother were arrested for assault and robbery. Kathleen and a friend had met Frank Martin, who had an expensive car and flashed a lot of cash as he treated the pair to drinks. Kathleen lamented to her friend how awful it was that some people, like Martin, seemed to have all the money. She quickly called her brother and hatched a plan. Luther joined Kathleen and Martin, and while driving on the outskirts of town, Luther instructed Martin to pull over. He then put the neck of a ketchup bottle into Martin's back and claimed to be holding a gun. However, the wealthy man didn't believe Luther and was struck in the head with the bottle as a result. The siblings took Martin's wallet and drove off, ditching the car near a bar. The entire plan was so flawed that as soon as Martin regained consciousness, he reported the incident to the police. The siblings hadn't even tried to disguise their identities. Luther was given 10 years behind bars while Kathleen was given 5, and they were both sent to West Virginia to serve their sentences. By the time of Kathleen's arrest, her son was almost 5 years old. He was initially taken in by his grandmother Nancy, but this soon changed because she still lived in Ashland, far away from Moundsville prison, and it was agreed that Manson should visit his mother as often as possible. As a result of this, he moved in with his Uncle Bill, Aunt Glenna, and 8-year-old cousin Joanne, residing with them in the blue-collar town of McMecken, West Virginia. By all accounts, the family, except Manson, were picture perfect. Glenna was a doting mother and active in her local church. Bill was a reliable worker, and Joanne kept up a steady stream of good grades at her local Protestant primary school. Manson, however, was described as a disagreeable child. Few who knew him during this time, or during his teen years, had anything positive to say about him. While he looked the part, being small in stature and having dimpled cheeks, he was known to lie frequently, break items in the home or at school, and never take accountability for anything he did wrong. He also craved attention and appeared to misbehave in order to attract some. His aunt and uncle attempted to show him affection, but it was short-lived as his behavior never seemed to improve, regardless of how he was treated. Throughout his childhood, Manson struggled to make friends, failed to improve his grades, and was frequently bullied. Even in adulthood, Manson was a poor reader who could do so only at a rudimentary level. Joanne, meanwhile, began to dislike her cousin. She recalled one particular event in which she watched Manson be hit by a bigger boy. Knowing it was her responsibility to look after the 5-year-old, she stood between the two boys and was hit by the bully. She then bit the finger of the bully, who ran off in shock. When a teacher asked what happened, Joanne explained everything, but Manson claimed he knew nothing more than that Joanne had bit the boy. Another experience she had was much more violent. At the time, Joanne was 10 and Manson was 7. She had been left in charge of him while her parents were out and had been instructed to clean. Manson often ignored his chores, and this time was no different. Although she had given him jobs to do, he decided not to do them. As Joanne made up the beds, Manson wandered in with a sharp sickle he'd found in the garden. He deliberately got in his cousin's way, and when she told him to go outside, he replied, "Make me." She pushed Manson out through the back door and locked him out of the house. In response, Manson screamed and slashed the screen door with the sickle. Joanne recalled that he looked and sounded completely out of control, and she feared the sickle would be used on her if he entered the home again. But her parents returned just moments after the door had been slashed. Manson told his relatives that he had been protecting himself, though they didn't believe him. During his time living with Bill and Glenna, Manson developed an interest in 3 things: music, knives, and guns. As an adult, he looked back on these years with a sense of loathing, telling an interviewer during the 1970s that all he remembered about his life back then was being told to do this or don't do that. It helped him form the opinion that adults should be separated from their children. The child is born free, and he should develop without restrictions. He also claimed that when he was 9, he set his school on fire. In 1942, Kathleen was paroled after 3 years behind bars. She decided that she and her son would strike out on their own, and she remained in McMecken for a period of time after her release, but eventually moved to Charleston. Now aged 8, Manson began skipping school and would often turn up at his mother's workplace, asking for sweets and procuring some by using the money he'd been given by store customers. Kathleen soon noticed her son's pattern of behavior. He lied, he tried to manipulate, and he was often interested in what people could do for him above all else. Notably, Kathleen's parenting skills hadn't improved since her time in prison. She still spent nights drinking and dancing, leaving Manson with questionable babysitters. She got engaged again, but the relationship quickly broke down before their union, and she was at one point arrested on charges of grand larceny, but the charges were later dropped. Following this, she and Manson left Charleston and drifted in and around Indianapolis. In August of 1943, she married a man named Lewis in Ohio, after meeting him at an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. But Lewis never stopped drinking and struggled to hold down a job. He had no interest in helping to raise Manson, who had begun to steal from stores. When confronted by his mother, Manson blamed anyone but himself for his actions. By the age of 12, Manson had started to run away from home, and his mother sent him to the Gibault School for Boys in Indianapolis. The school was meant to provide a positive learning environment for delinquents and was run by Catholic priests, but it was a strict establishment that meant even the smallest infraction could result in beatings with either a wooden paddle or a leather strap. Manson eventually fled the school and began to sleep rough, though he spent Christmas 1947 at Bill and Glenna's house, where he stole Bill's gun. His mother returned him to school. 10 months passed before he fled again. In 1948, he robbed several stores in Indianapolis, using the money to rent a room, despite the fact that he was only 13 years old. Manson did briefly attempt to live a crime-free life. He took a job delivering messages for Western Union, but it wasn't long before he supplemented his income by participating in petty crime. He was caught thieving in 1949 and was sent to Boys Town, a juvenile facility in Nebraska. After just 4 days, he and a fellow student stole a car and carried out 2 armed robberies while traveling to Illinois. The uncle of Manson's fellow student was a professional thief, and he supposedly took the pair on as apprentices. This career path didn't last long, however, as Manson was arrested 2 weeks later and sent to the Indiana Boys School, another strict reform establishment. This school appears to have been the worst one of all. Here, Manson was allegedly sexually assaulted by other students with the encouragement of a particularly horrific staff member. This sexual abuse led him to grimly take on a detached view of rape, whether it was endured by him or other people. In later years, he stated, getting raped, they can just wipe that off. I don't feel that someone got violated and it's a terrible thing. I just thought clean it off, that's all that is. Manson was also violently beaten on numerous occasions at the school, and he fled from the establishment 18 different times. Manson eventually escaped for good in February of 1951, accompanied by 2 other students. The trio robbed petrol stations while attempting to drive to California in stolen vehicles. They were arrested in Utah, and Manson was sent to Washington, D.C.'s National Training School for Boys, where he was supposed to remain until the age of 21. Upon his arrival, it was discovered that he was illiterate, but had an above-average IQ of 109, while his caseworker labeled him as aggressively antisocial, blaming his family life, if it can be called family life at all. It's unclear if the worker took Manson at his word on everything, as Manson often exaggerated the stories he told about his childhood, or if he received input from Kathleen and other family members. Life in prison. Manson was transferred to Natural Bridge Honor Camp in October 1951, at the recommendation of a psychiatrist. He was 17 at the time, and the minimum security institution allowed family members to visit him. After his aunt agreed to take him and help him find work, Manson's parole was scheduled for February of 1951, but just 1 month before this, he was found sexually abusing a boy at knife point. As a result, his parole was cancelled and he was moved to the Federal Reformatory in Petersburg, Virginia. This failed to curb Manson's worsening behaviour, however, as he was involved in a further 8 serious disciplinary offences, which included sex offences, and was moved to a maximum security correctional institution at Chillicothe, Ohio. He was expected to stay here until he turned 21, but he was released 18 months early due to good behaviour. His Aunt Glenna and Uncle Bill brought him into their home, once again in McMecken. 8 months after his release, in January 1955, Manson married a hospital waitress named Rosalie Willis, who soon became pregnant. That summer, the couple moved to Los Angeles, and in October, he was charged with a federal crime for taking a stolen vehicle across state lines, from Ohio to California. Manson was given another psychiatric evaluation, where it was concluded that he was a poor risk for probation, but with the incentive of a wife and probable fatherhood, it is possible that he might be able to straighten himself out. He was given 5 years probation, but he was arrested in 1956 in Indianapolis after he failed to appear at a hearing in LA pertaining to an identical vehicle theft charge in Florida. His probation was revoked and was given 3 years behind bars at Terminal Island Penitentiary. While Manson was in prison, his wife gave birth to their son, Charles Manson Jr. Both Rosalie and Kathleen visited him for the first year that he was inside, and the pair were living together raising Charles Jr. However, in March of 1957, Kathleen visited Manson alone and informed him that Rosalie had taken up with another man. Manson was given another 5 years probation after he attempted to steal a car and escape prison, just 2 weeks before a parole hearing, obviously affected by his wife's abandonment. On September 30th, 1958, Manson was released from prison after serving 2 years and 5 months of his sentence. A condition of his release, however, is that he had to report regularly to a parole officer. Around this same time, he issued a decree of divorce to Rosalie and moved in with his mother, who was now estranged from her husband, Louis. Manson struggled to keep a job and eventually began pimping out teenage girls. He ran into trouble with the law once again when 1 year after his release, he pled guilty to a charge of attempting to cash a forged US Treasury check. He claimed to have stolen it from a mailbox, and the charge was later dropped. Manson then took 19-year-old Leona Musa, whom he soon married, and another young woman to New Mexico, where he intended to pimp them out, and as a result of this, he was apprehended, held, and questioned for violating the Mann Act. He was released, but the investigation continued. Manson vanished shortly afterwards, violating his probation, and an arrest warrant was issued, shortly followed by an indictment for violation of the Mann Act. He was eventually arrested in June 1960 in Texas. Back in LA, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison for violating his probation on the check cashing charge. The Mann Act charge was dropped. In 1963, Leona and Manson divorced. She alleged that they had a son named Charles Luther. The Manson Family formation. Manson was released from prison early on March 21st, 1967, age 32. Following this, he made the decision to move from LA to Berkeley, although he would soon move again to the Haight-Ashbury district in San Francisco with the permission of his new probation officer. Shortly after his release from prison, Manson experimented with LSD and became a frequent user of the substance. His probation officer was paid to study the effects of such drugs, alongside the founder of the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, David Smith, the latter of whom noted that the change in Manson's personality during this time was the most abrupt Roger Smith had ever observed in his entire professional career. Adding to Manson's change in attitude was the fact that he'd read the sci-fi novel Stranger in a Strange Land by Robert A. Heinlein, and he was inspired by this and the free love movement that was blossoming in Haight-Ashbury to create his own philosophy, which he began to preach. It was based on Stranger in a Strange Land, the Bible, Scientology, and the works of the Beatles and American writer Dale Carnegie. The Manson family would later become a doomsday cult when Manson became fixated on the prospect of an apocalyptic race war between America's black population and its white population. He was a firm white supremacist and claimed that one day black citizens would rise up and kill all white people, except for Manson and the family, and that they would need someone, a white man, to lead them because their intelligence was inferior to that of white people. These remaining black citizens would serve Manson as their master. Manson's first follower was a library assistant named Mary Brunner, a 23-year-old who worked at the University of California in Berkeley, and allowed Manson to sleep at her home for a few nights. It was supposed to be temporary, but it appeared that Brunner was easily charmed by the career criminal, and it became a somewhat permanent arrangement. She quickly became pregnant with Manson's child and gave birth to a son on April 15, 1968, whom she named Valentine Michael. At the time of the birth, the pair were living in a condemned house in Topanga Canyon, along with several other women who were followers of Manson's. Brunner and Manson met Lynette Alice Squeaky Fromme in Venice Beach in 1967 when she was just 19. She had dropped out of university and been made homeless after her father kicked her out of the house following an argument. Fromme had lived a troubled life which involved her using drugs and alcohol, and she had barely graduated high school, attending university only with the encouragement of her family. Shortly after meeting Manson, she became the family's second member, traveling with him and Brunner, while meeting and recruiting other young women. Over the course of the next 2 years, the group expanded to include between 20 and 30 individuals living communally, with Manson targeting people who were vulnerable and emotionally insecure. This number later reportedly grew to 100. They traveled along the California coast and visited Washington State, Oregon, and Nevada, eventually settling down at the Spahn Ranch in LA, a location that was sometimes used as a film set. While Manson preached love and freedom, he had a tight grip on the group and often ordered his female following to have sex with men, including the ranch owner George Spahn, a partially blind 80-year-old. He also had the group participate in criminal activities, including theft and fraud, and he possessed illegal firearms. At some point, he even hosted a violent motorcycle gang. David Smith, who wrote a book about his time with the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, claimed that Manson attempted to reprogram the minds of his followers so they would submit totally to his will through the use of LSD and unconventional sexual practices that would turn his followers into empty vessels that would accept anything he poured. A family member named Paul Watkins later testified that Manson would encourage the group to take LSD, but take a much lower dose himself so that he could keep his wits about him. Notably, Manson grew his following while still under the supervision of his parole officer, Roger Smith, but this didn't keep him out of trouble with law enforcement. He was arrested on July 31, 1967, for attempting to prevent the arrest of one of his followers, Ruth Ann Morehouse. But his charge was reduced to a misdemeanor, and he was given 3 more years of probation. Then, on April 21, 1968, he was arrested again, along with 8 other members of the Manson family, after their bus crashed into a ditch during the move from San Francisco to Los Angeles. The police stumbled across the scene, which included Manson, members of the family, and his newborn baby sleeping naked by the bus. He was shortly thereafter arrested again for drug-related offences, although he was released after just a few days. Criminal activity. Theft and fraud weren't the only crimes the Manson family participated in. One of Manson's most loyal members, Charles Denton Tex Watson, soon brought violence to the group when he became involved in drug dealing and stole from another dealer named Bernard Crowe. Aggravated by the theft, Crowe allegedly threatened to kill everyone at the ranch, something which greatly bothered Manson, who took it upon himself to shoot Crowe on July 1, 1969. Originally, a family member named Thomas Wallerman was supposed to carry out the shooting using a .22 caliber buntline revolver. However, he backed out of pulling the trigger, leaving Manson to do it instead. After shooting Crowe, the pair stole his leather jacket and fled. Notably, Manson believed he had killed the dealer. The following day, the body of a Black Panther member was discovered, having been fatally shot, which cemented his beliefs. But it would later transpire that Crowe was not a member of the Black Panthers, and he had survived his wounds, eventually dying in the 1990s. Later that same month, the family carried out the murder of a music teacher and PhD student named Gary Allen Hinman, who attended the University of California, Los Angeles. Gary had befriended several members of the family at some point during the 1960s, allowing them to stay at his home, and Manson soon became convinced that the teacher was wealthy and had a lot of assets to his name. On July 25th, he sent several members, including Mary Brunner and Bobby Beausoleil, who'd only recently joined the family, to Gary's house, and ordered them to convince him to join the group and turn over his assets and anything of worth. The members held Gary hostage for 2 days, as he continuously denied having any money or anything of value. Manson visited during this time armed with a sword, which he used to attack the teacher, slashing his face and ear. Afterwards, Beausoleil, reportedly on Manson's instruction, fatally stabbed Gary. Before leaving the home, one of the family members used his blood to write "Political Piggy" on the wall. They added a panther paw next to it, a symbol for the Black Panthers. Beausoleil was arrested on August 6th after he was caught driving Gary's car. The murder weapon was still in the back of the vehicle. The Tate Murders. From here, the group's violence only escalated. On August 8, 1969, Tex Watson, along with family members Susan Atkins, Linda Kasabian, and Patricia Krenwinkel, visited 10050 Silo Drive in Benedict Canyon, LA, after Manson had reportedly instructed Watson to totally destroy the residence and everyone else inside the building, adding that he should do it as gruesome as you can. The 3 women who'd accompanied Watson had been told to do as he said. The Cielo Drive home belonged to Hollywood movie director Roman Polanski and his wife, actress Sharon Tate, who was 8.5 months pregnant at the time. Also inside the building was Jay Sebring, a celebrity hairstylist, Roman's friend Wojciech Frykowski, and his girlfriend Abigail Folger, William Garrettson, the property caretaker, and his friend Stephen Parent. The 4 Manson family members arrived at the residence just after midnight on August 9th. They cut the phone line to the house and left their car at the bottom of the hill, entering the property via an embankment near the gate, as they were concerned that the fence was electrified or had an alarm. The first victim that night was 18-year-old Stephen Parent, who was on his way to visit the caretaker. Stephen had been approaching the house in his car when Watson stepped out and made the vehicle come to a halt. He then leveled a .22 caliber revolver at Stephen, who begged for his life and promised not to say anything. However, Watson ignored the young man's pleas and lunged at him with a knife, slashing him on the palm of his hand and severing several tendons. The attack also tore Stephen's watch from his wrist. Watson then fatally shot the 18-year-old 4 times in the chest and abdomen. Afterwards, he and the other family members moved his vehicle before heading over to the building. They cut the screen of a window, and Watson ordered Linda Kasabian to keep watch down by the gate, where they'd left Stephen's car. Watson entered the home through the window and let the other women in via the front door. Inside, Watson woke Wojciech Frykowski, who was asleep on the living room couch, and kicked him in the head. When Wojciech asked who Watson was and what he was doing there, the Manson family member replied, "I'm the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business." Atkins and Krenwinkel then went to round up the other 3 occupants of the house and brought them into the living room. Sharon Tate and Jay Sebring were tied together at the neck with rope, which Watson then threw over a ceiling beam. However, when Jay complained about the group's rough treatment of Sharon, Watson shot him before stabbing him 7 times. Abigail Folger, meanwhile, gave the group $70 from her purse in the hopes that all they wanted was money, and her boyfriend, Wojciech, managed to free himself after his hands were bound with a towel. He immediately rose to his feet and attacked Atkins, who in turn stabbed at his legs with a knife. He managed to make his way to the front door, but Watson, who was ruthless and determined to see his plan through, struck him over the head with his gun several times, before repeatedly stabbing him and shooting him twice. Linda Kasabian, who was still stationed at the estate's gates where Stephen's car sat, moved towards the house upon hearing horrible sounds. Inside, Abigail managed to escape from Patricia Krenwinkel and fled to the pool area. However, she was pursued and was soon caught in the front garden, where she was tackled to the ground and stabbed. Watson aided in Abigail's death, and the pair stabbed the heiress a total of 28 times. Wojciech, shockingly, was still alive after all that he had endured. He struggled across the garden, but again Watson went after him, stabbing him repeatedly until he died. In total, Wojciech suffered 51 stab wounds and had been struck 13 times by Watson's gun. Sharon Tate was the last one alive inside the house. She pleaded to be allowed to live until she could give birth to her baby, and offered to be the group's hostage, but her desperate appeals fell on deaf ears. She was stabbed 16 times. With the residents dead and the home now a bloodbath, the family members got ready to leave. Atkins wrote "pig" on the front door in Sharon's blood and claimed that she did so to try and throw off investigators and get Bobby Beausoleil released from custody. According to several family members, including Atkins herself and Patricia Krenwinkel, the arrest of Beausoleil was what prompted them to carry out the horrifically violent murder spree. They wanted to convince the police that Gary Hinman's killer was still free. A police detective who worked on the Tate murders confirmed this idea, as did one of the prosecutors on the case, Aaron Stovitz. However, there is also some speculation that the violence came in retaliation to a drug deal gone wrong. Some individuals believe that Manson went to the home the night before the murders to sell marijuana and cocaine to Jay Sebring and Wojciech Frykowski, but that they beat Manson. Both men were known to be involved in the drug trade. The murders became national news, later on August 9th, when the housekeeper arrived for work. The only surviving resident of the home was the caretaker, 19-year-old William Garretson, who stayed in the guest house. He was initially considered a suspect, but was released after taking a polygraph test. The Tate murders were described as satanic, and this targeted attack on some of Hollywood's biggest names led to many celebrities upping their security measures or leaving town altogether. The following night, on August 10th, Watson, Krenwinkel, Atkins, and Kasabian, along with Manson himself and two more of his followers, Leslie Van Houten and Clem Grogan, headed to a house at 3301 Waverly Drive in the Los Feliz area of LA. The residence belonged to a supermarket executive, Leno LaBianca, and his wife Rosemary, who was the co-owner of a clothing shop. The couple were bound at the wrists and pillowcases were placed over their heads, kept in place using lamp cords. Leno was roused from his sleep on the couch by gunpoint, while Rosemary was kept in the bedroom so that Watson could begin his attack. He began stabbing Leno with a chrome-plated bayonet, and then in the bedroom, discovered Rosemary swinging a lamp at the other members of the group. He stabbed her too, before returning to attack Leno, who was stabbed 12 times in total. He also carved the word "where" into his abdomen. In the bedroom, Krenwinkel and Van Houten stabbed Rosemary over 16 times, while evidence would later show that she was stabbed 41 times post-mortem. Krenwinkel used the blood of the victims to write "Rise" and "Death to Pigs" on the walls, as well as "Helter Skelter," spelt wrongly, on the door of the fridge. Adding to the grotesque violence, Krenwinkel then attacked Leno, who was already dead, by using a carving fork to leave 14 puncture wounds behind. She left the instrument protruding from his stomach and planted a steak knife in his throat. Later, Van Houten would claim that the crime had been committed because Manson stated that they needed to help initiate the race war. He had taken Rosemary's purse from the scene and planned to plant it where it could be found by a black individual, and the murders could be pinned on them, thus inciting public outrage that he hoped would lead to chaos. The group had planned to murder Lebanese actor Saladin Nader afterwards, but Kasabian reportedly thwarted Manson's plan by knocking on the wrong door and waking a stranger. The LaBianca deaths were discovered around 19 hours after they had been committed at 10:30 p.m. by Rosemary's son, 15-year-old Frank Struthers, who had returned home from a camping trip. He was alarmed by the fact that his stepfather's speedboat was still attached to the family car and the curtains were all drawn. He alerted his older sister and her boyfriend, who accompanied the 15-year-old into the house, where they discovered the gruesome crime scene. Initially, a connection between the Tate murders and the LaBianca murders was ruled out. Through following up on leads, detectives working on the LaBianca case spoke with members of a motorcycle gang who Manson had hired after the shooting of Bernard Crowe, when he had expected retaliation from the Black Panthers. The gang members provided information to the police that suggested a link between Manson and his following and the Tate LaBianca murders. Meanwhile, someone close to Susan Atkins tipped the police off to the family's involvement in the slayings. Atkins herself went to the authorities to claim responsibility for Gary Hinman's murder, where she was subsequently transferred to a detention center in Monterey Park, California, named the Sybil Brand Institute. Here, Atkins confessed to her cellmates that she had killed Sharon Tate and been involved with the Tate LaBianca crimes. She would later indicate in her statements that Tex Watson was the one who'd killed Sharon, something which Watson admitted to in his 1978 autobiography. However, he falsely testified during the trials that he didn't, as he was aware that both the prosecutor and the jury were convinced Atkins was responsible. Manson was taken into custody in October of 1969, along with a few of his followers. They were arrested at Barker Ranch in Death Valley on suspicion of vehicle theft. On December 1st, arrest warrants were issued for Watson, Krenwinkel and Kasabian, the latter of whom voluntarily surrendered to police in New Hampshire the following day. Krenwinkel and Watson were already under arrest in Alabama and Texas, respectively. Their fingerprints had been found at the Tate crime scene, while the gun Watson had used was handed over by a local neighborhood boy who'd stumbled across it. Ballistics testing confirmed that it was the same weapon used in the murders. Other physical evidence included the clothing of the Tate killers, discovered by a local ABC television crew, and a knife that had been found in the living room and belonged to Susan Atkins. Other knives used in the attack that had been discarded while the group had fled the residence were never recovered. The trial. The state of California tried Manson for the Tate LaBianca murders, along with co-defendants Leslie Van Houten, Susan Atkins, and Patricia Krenwinkel. Tex Watson was tried at a later date. The trial began on July 15, 1970, and on the 24th, which was the first day of testimony, Manson appeared in court with an X carved into his forehead. It would later become a swastika. His followers released a statement from him which said, "I have X'd myself from your world." His co-defendants followed suit the next day, carving X shapes into their foreheads. Other family members who were not involved in the trials had been excluded from the courtroom for their disruptions. Instead, they waited outside the courthouse and held vigils. Some of them carved X's into their heads in solidarity, while others claimed they would set themselves alight if Manson was found guilty. The star witness during the trial was Linda Kasabian, who gave testimony in exchange for immunity. She provided graphic testimony about the Tate murders, as she had witnessed much of it from outside the building, and noted that she had been present in the vehicle when Manson had ordered the LaBianca slayings. In early August 1970, President Richard Nixon told the media that he believed Manson was guilty of the murders, either directly or indirectly. Manson's defense lawyers then called for a mistrial, arguing that he and his co-defendants had allegedly killed far fewer people than Nixon's war machine in Vietnam. However, the jury was spoken with, and each member confirmed that they could reach a verdict independently without being affected by President Nixon's words. 2 months later, on October 5th, Manson attempted to attack Judge Charles Older while the jury was present. He initially threatened the judge before jumping over his lawyer's table with a sharpened pencil and moving towards Older. As he was removed from the courtroom, Manson screamed, "In the name of Christian justice, someone should cut your head off." His co-defendants then began chanting in Latin. On November 16, 1970, the state of California rested its case after presenting 22 weeks' worth of evidence. The defense also rested their case, noting they had no witnesses to present. The lawyers did not want any of the women or Manson to give testimony. However, the 3 women wanted to testify that Manson was not involved, and began to shout their frustrations in court. The following day, Manson announced that he too wished to testify. He did so without a jury. He stated, "These children that come at you with knives, they are your children. You taught them. I didn't teach them. I just tried to help them stand up. Most of the people at the ranch that you call the family were just people that you did not want." Manson then added, "I know this, that in your hearts and your souls, you are as much responsible for the Vietnam War as I am for killing these people. I can't judge any of you. I have no malice against you and no ribbons for you. But I think that it is high time that you all start looking at yourselves and judging the lie that you live in." After speaking in front of Judge Older, Manson declined to speak in front of a jury and told his co-defendants that they didn't need to testify. On November 30th, Leslie Van Houten's lawyer, Ronald Hughes, didn't show up for closing arguments. He was discovered dead in a California state park, but due to decomposition, it was impossible to determine his cause of death. Notably, Ronald disagreed with Manson during the trial, He believed Van Houten should not testify in his defense, and it has been alleged that Ronald was murdered by the Manson family in response to this. On January 25, 1971, Manson, Krenwinkel, and Atkins were found guilty of first-degree murder in all 7 of the Tate and LaBianca killings. Van Houten was found guilty of first-degree murder in the LaBianca case. A separate hearing was set up with the same jury to decide if the perpetrators should be given the death penalty. During this hearing, Manson's co-defendants took the stand and gave in-depth details about the crimes. They emphasized that Manson was not involved and explained that the slayings had occurred because they wanted Bobby Beausoleil released from prison following the murder of Gary Hinman. The women also testified that they had carried out the crimes under the direction of Linda Kasabian, who had testified against all of them. Notably, neither Atkins, Krenwinkel, nor Van Houten apologized or displayed or voiced feelings of guilt for what they had done. During the sentencing hearings, Manson shaved his head and trimmed his beard to a fork, claiming, "I am the devil, and the devil always has a bald head." On March 29, 1971, all 4 defendants were sentenced to death. By this time, Manson's co-defendants had shaved their heads as he had. Atkins told the jury, "Better lock your doors and watch your kids." The aftermath. In 1972, the death penalty was ruled unconstitutional, so Manson was resentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole in 1977. In 1971, he had also been convicted of the first-degree murders of Gary Hinman and Donald Jerome Shorty Shea, a stuntman who'd been killed around August 26, 1969. Due to the new rules in place, Manson was able to apply for parole after just 7 years in prison. His first appeal in November of 1978 was rejected. After March of 1997, when he was denied parole again, Manson stopped attending the hearings. The panel pointed out his history of controlling behavior and mental health issues, which included schizophrenia and paranoid delusional disorder, and felt he was too great a risk to be let out of prison. In April 2012, he was denied parole for the 12th time. It was then determined that he would not be considered for parole for another 15 years, which would be in 2027, making him 92 years old. During his time in prison, Manson gave 4 interviews. In 2007, MSNBC aired The Mind of Manson, a complete version of one of the interviews which he gave in 1987. Only 7 minutes of it had previously been broadcast, as the footage of Manson had been considered unbelievable, due to him being unapologetic and unruly. In 2010, the Los Angeles Times reported that Manson had been caught with a mobile phone 1 year earlier, contacting people in California, New Jersey, Florida, and British Columbia, Canada. It was not known if it had been used for criminal purposes. Around this time, Manson also recorded an album of acoustic pop songs titled Completion, which has never been made public. Only 5 copies were ever pressed. In 2014, Manson became engaged to a 26-year-old named Afton Elaine Burton. The pair obtained a marriage license in November, but it expired in February 2015 before a ceremony could be carried out. It was reported in the media that Manson had discovered that Elaine had only wanted to marry him, so that she could use his corpse as an attraction after his death. Far from a model prisoner, Manson was described as perpetually disruptive, and even joined the Aryan Brotherhood while behind bars. Female officers tended to receive the vast majority of his verbal abuse. Charles Manson died on November 19, 2017, in hospital at the age of 83. His cause of death was cardiac arrest, which he had suffered due to respiratory failure that had been brought on by colon cancer. There was much debate afterwards about who was responsible for Manson's estate and his body, the latter of which ultimately went to his grandson, Jason Freeman, who had Manson cremated on March 20, 2018. As for Manson's co-defendants, Susan Atkins was denied parole 14 times, although some articles claim it was 18 times. She died from brain cancer on September 24, 2009, aged 61, while still in prison after she was denied compassionate release. Patricia Krenwinkel became the state's longest-serving female inmate after Atkins's death. In May of 2022, she was recommended for release, but Governor Gavin Newsom blocked her parole, noting she still poses an unreasonable danger to society if paroled at this time. This marked the 15th time her parole was denied. Leslie Van Houten was granted a retrial in 1976 due to her lawyer's death, but she was found guilty again and has been imprisoned since 1978. Her fourth attempt at gaining parole failed on November 25, 2022. Linda Kasabian, the prosecution's star witness, changed her name and moved across the country after the trial, while Lynette Squeaky Frome, one of Manson's earliest followers who was not involved with the Tate LaBianca murders, was charged and convicted for the 1975 attempted assassination of President Gerald R. Ford. She received a life sentence, but was released on parole in 2009 and published an autobiography in 2018. Meanwhile, Tex Watson is still in prison in San Diego. He has been denied parole 18 times since 1976. Although Manson was only charged in connection with 9 murders, he and his family are believed to have taken the lives of many others. The LAPD has estimated that the group were responsible for 12 more slayings, while a prosecutor claimed that Manson had bragged to his cellmates about being culpable for 35. On the surface, Manson looked like an outsider, a hippie with firm beliefs about the world and how it all worked. But looking a little closer, he was your average racist misogynist who brushed shoulders with many of Hollywood's big shots. Shortly before the Tate LaBianca murders, his leadership of the family led him to meet Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys, as well as several other record producers and executives. He seemed to enjoy the connections he had made and the benefits they brought him. He was not opposed to luxuries and materialism in the way that he claimed to be. Similarly, Manson wasn't about free love or sexual liberation. He targeted vulnerable women, used and abused them, and often sent them to be sexual servants of men he wanted something from. He was manipulative and calculating. As his mother had noticed all those years ago when he was a little boy, Charles Manson focused on one thing and one thing only: what could other people do for him?